Character by Samuel Smiles. Chapter 10, Part D. We have said that a man may be known by the company he keeps in his books. Let us mention a few of the favorites of the best-known men. Plutarch's admirers have already been referred to. Montaigne also has been the companion of most meditative men. Although Shakespeare must have studied Plutarch carefully, inasmuch as he copied from him freely, even to his very words, it is remarkable that Montaigne is the only book which we certainly know to have been in the poet's library. One of Shakespeare's existing autographs has been found in a copy of Florio's translation of the Essays, which also contains on the flyleaf the autograph of Ben Jonson. Milton's favorite books were Homer, Ovid, and Euripides. The latter book was also the favorite of Charles James Fox, who regarded the study of it as especially useful to a public speaker. On the other hand, Pitt took especial delight in Milton, whom Fox did not appreciate, taking pleasure in reciting from Paradise Lost the grand speech of Belial before the assembled powers of Pandemonium. Another of Pitt's favorite books was Newton's Principia. Again, the Earl of Chatham's favorite book was Barrow's Sermons, which he read so often as to be able to repeat them from memory, while Burke's companions were Demosthenes, Milton, Bolingbroke, and Young's Night Thoughts. Curran's favorite was Homer, which he read through once a year. Virgil was another of his favorites, his biographer Phillips saying that he once saw him reading the Aeneid in the cabin of a Holyhead packet, while everyone around him was prostrate by seasickness. Of the poets, Dante's favorite was Virgil, Corneille's was Lucain, Schiller's was Shakespeare, Gray's was Spenser, whilst Coleridge admired Collins and Bowles. Dante himself was a favorite with most great poets, from Chaucer to Byron and Tennyson. Lord Brougham, Macaulay, and Carlyle have alike admired and eulogized the great Italian. The former advised the students at Glasgow that, next to Demosthenes, the study of Dante was the best preparative for the eloquence of the pulpit or the bar. Robert Hall sought relief in Dante from the racking pains of spinal disease, and Sidney Smith took to the same poet for comfort and solace in his old age. It was characteristic of Goethe that his favorite book should have been Spinoza's Ethics, in which he said he had found a peace and consolation such as he had been able to find in no other work. Barrow's favorite was St. Chrysostom, Bossuet's was Homer, Bunyan's was the old legend of Sir Bevis of Southampton, which in all probability gave him the first idea of his Pilgrim's Progress. One of the best prelates that ever sat on the English bench, Dr. John Sharp, said, "Shakespeare and the Bible have made me Archbishop of York." The two books which most impressed John Wesley when a young man were The Imitation of Christ and Jeremy Taylor's Holy Living and Dying. Yet Wesley was accustomed to caution his young friends against overmuch reading. "Beware you be not swallowed up in books," he would say to them. "An ounce of love is worth a pound of knowledge." Wesley's own life had been a great favorite with many thoughtful readers. Coleridge says in his preface to Southey's Life of Wesley that it was more often in his hands than any other in his ragged book regiment. "To this work and to the life of Richard Baxter," he says, quote, "I was used to resort whenever sickness and languor made me feel the want of an old friend of whose company I could never be tired. How many and many an hour of self-oblivion do I owe to this life of Wesley, and how often have I argued with it, questioned, remonstrated, been peevish, and asked pardon, then again listened and cried, 'Right, excellent,' and in yet heavier hours entreated it, as it were, to continue talking to me, for that I heard and listened and was soothed, though I could make no reply." End quote. Sumet had only a very few books in his library, but they were of the best. Homer, Virgil, Dante, Camoens, Tasso, and Milton. De Quincey's favorite few were Donne, Chillingworth, Jeremy Taylor, Milton, South, Barrow, and Sir Thomas Browne. He described these writers as a pleiad or constellation of 7 golden stars, such as in their class no literature can match, and from whose works he would undertake to build up an entire body of philosophy. Frederick the Great of Prussia manifested his strong French leanings in his choice of books, his principal favorites being Bayle, Rousseau, Voltaire, Rollin, Fleury, Malebranche, and one English author, Locke. His especial favorite was Bayle's Dictionary, which was the first book that lay hold of his mind, and he thought so highly of it that he made himself an abridgment and translation of it into German, which was published. It was a saying of Frederick's that books make up no small part of true happiness. In his old age, he said, "My latest passion will be for literature." It seems odd that Marshall Blucher's favorite book should have been Klopstock's Messiah, and Napoleon Bonaparte's favorites, Ossian's Poems and The Sorrows of Werther. But Napoleon's range of reading was very extensive. It included Homer, Virgil, Tasso, novels of all countries, histories of all times, mathematics, legislation, and theology. He detested what he called the bombast and tinsel of Voltaire. The praises of Homer and Ossian he was never wearied of sounding. "Read again," he said to an officer on board the Bellerophon. Quote, "Read again the poets of Achilles, devour Ossian. Those are the poets who lift up the soul and give to man a colossal greatness." End quote. The Duke of Wellington was an extensive reader. His principal favorites were Clarendon, Bishop Butler, Smith's Wealth of Nations, Hume, the Archduke Charles, Leslie, and the Bible. He was also particularly interested by French and English memoirs, more especially the French Mémoires pour servir of all kinds. When at Walmer, Mr. Gleig says, the Bible, the prayer book, Taylor's Holy Living and Dying, and Caesar's commentaries lay within the Duke's reach, and judging by the marks of use on them, they must have been much read and often consulted. While books are among the best companions of old age, they are often the best inspirers of youth. The first book that makes a deep impression on a young man's mind often constitutes an epoch in his life. It may fire the heart, stimulate the enthusiasm, and by directing his efforts into unexpected channels, permanently influence his character. The new book, in which we form an intimacy with a new friend, whose mind is wiser and riper than our own, may thus form an important starting point in the history of a life. It may sometimes almost be regarded in the light of a new birth. From the day when James Edward Smith was presented with his first botanical lesson book and Sir Joseph Banks fell in with Gerard's Herbal, from the time when Alfieri first read Plutarch and Schiller made his first acquaintance with Shakespeare, and Gibbon devoured the first volume of The Universal History, each dated an inspiration so exalted that they felt as if their real lives had only then begun. In the earlier part of his youth, La Fontaine was distinguished for his idleness, but hearing an ode by Malherbe read, he is said to have exclaimed, "I too am a poet," and his genius was awakened. Charles Bossuet's mind was first fired to study by reading at an early age Fontenelle's Éloge of Men of Science. Another work of Fontenelle, On the Plurality of Worlds, influenced the mind of Lalande in making choice of a profession. "It is with pleasure," says Lalande himself in a preface to the book, which he afterwards edited, quote, "that I acknowledge my obligation to it for that devouring activity which its perusal first excited in me at the age of 16, and which I have since retained." End quote. In like manner, La Cepede was directed to the study of natural history by the perusal of Buffon's Histoire naturelle, which he found in his father's library, and read over and over again until he almost knew it by heart. Goethe was greatly influenced by the reading of Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield, just at the critical moment of his mental development, and he attributed to it much of his best education. The reading of a prose Life of Götz Wuberlichingen afterwards stimulated him to delineate his character in a poetic form. "The figure of a rude, well-meaning self-helper," he said, "in a wild, anarchic time, excited my deepest sympathy." Keats was an insatiable reader when a boy, but it was the perusal of The Faerie Queene at the age of 17 that first lit the fire of his genius. The same poem is also said to have been the inspirer of Cowley, who found a copy of it accidentally lying on the window of his mother's apartment, and reading and admiring it, he became, as he relates, irrecoverably a poet. Coleridge speaks of the great influence which the poems of Bowles had in forming his own mind. "The works of a past age," says he, "seem to a young man to be things of another race, but the writings of a contemporary possesses a reality for him, and inspire an actual friendship as of a man for a man. His very admiration is the wind which fans and feeds his hope. The poems themselves assume the properties of flesh and blood. But men have not merely been stimulated to undertake special literary pursuits by the perusal of particular books. They have been also stimulated by them to enter upon particular lines of action in the serious business of life. Thus, Henry Martyn was powerfully influenced to enter upon his heroic career as a missionary by perusing the lives of Henry Brainerd and Dr. Carey, who had opened up the furrows in which he went forth to sow the seed. Bentham has described the extraordinary influence which the perusal of Telemachus exercised upon his mind in boyhood. "Another book," said he, quote, "and of far higher character was placed in my hands. It was Telemachus. In my own imagination, and at the age of 6 or 7, I identified my own personality with that of the hero, who seemed to me a model of perfect virtue. And in my walk of life, whatever it may come to be, why should I not be a Telemachus? That romance may be regarded as the foundation stone of my whole character, the starting post from whence my career of life commenced. The first dawning in my mind of the principles of unity may, I think, be traced to it." End quote. Cobbett's first favorite, because his only book, which he bought for 3d, was Swift's Tale of a Tub, the repeated perusal of which had doubtless much to do with the formation of his pithy, straightforward, and hard-hitting style of writing. The delight with which Pope, when a schoolboy, read Ogilvy's Homer was most probably the origin of the English Iliad, as the Percy Reliques fired the juvenile mind of Scott and stimulated him to enter upon the collection and composition of his border ballads. Cately's first reading of Paradise Lost when a boy led to his afterwards undertaking his life of the poet. "The reading," he says, quote, "of Paradise Lost for the first time forms, or should form, an era in the life of everyone possessed of taste and poetic feeling. To my mind that time is ever present. Ever since, the poetry of Milton has formed my constant study, a source of delight in prosperity, of strength and consolation in adversity." End quote. Good books are thus among the best of companions, and by elevating the thoughts and aspirations, they act as preservatives against low associations. "A natural turn for reading and intellectual pursuits," says Thomas Hood, quote, "probably preserved me from the moral shipwreck so apt to befall those who are deprived in early life of their parental pilotage. My books kept me from the ring, the dog pit, the tavern, the saloon. The closest associate of Pope and Addison, the mind accustomed to the noble though silent discourse of Shakespeare and Milton, will hardly seek or put up with low company and slaves." End quote. It has been truly said that the best books are those which most resemble good actions. They are purifying, elevating, and sustaining. They enlarge and liberalize the mind. They preserve it against vulgar worldliness. They tend to produce high-minded cheerfulness and equanimity of character. They fashion and shape and humanize the mind. In the northern universities, the schools in which the ancient classics are studied are appropriately styled the humanity classes. Erasmus, the great scholar, was even of opinion that books were the necessaries of life, and clothes the luxuries, and he frequently postponed buying the latter until he had supplied himself with the former. His greatest favorites were the works of Cicero, which he says he always felt himself the better for reading. "I can never," he says, quote, "read the works of Cicero on old age or friendship, or his Tusculan disputations, without fervently pressing them to my lips, without being penetrated with veneration for a mind little short of inspired by God himself." End quote. It was the accidental perusal of Cicero's Hortensius which first detached St. Augustine, until then a profligate and abandoned sensualist, from his immoral life and started him upon the course of inquiry and study which led to his becoming the greatest among the fathers of the early church. Sir William Jones made it a practice to read through once a year the writings of Cicero, whose life, indeed, says his biographer, was the great exemplar of his own. When the good old Puritan Baxter came to enumerate the valuable and delightful things of which death would deprive him, his mind reverted to the pleasures he had derived from books and study. "When I die," he said, quote, "I must depart not only from sensual delights, but from the more manly pleasures of my studies, knowledge, and converse with many wise and godly men, and from all my pleasure in reading, hearing, public and private exercises of religion, and such like. I must leave my library and turn over those pleasant books no more. I must no more come along the living, nor see the faces of my faithful friends, nor be seen of man. Houses and cities and fields and countries, gardens and walks will be as nothing to me. I shall hear no more of the affairs of the world, of men, or wars, or other news, nor see what becomes of that beloved interest of wisdom, piety, and peace which I desire may prosper." End quote. It is unnecessary to speak of the enormous moral influence which books have exercised upon the general civilization of mankind from the Bible downwards. They contain the treasured knowledge of the human race. They are the record of all labors, achievements, speculations, successes, and failures in science, philosophy, religion, and morals. They have been the greatest motive powers in all times. From the Gospel to the Contrat Social, says de Bonald, it is books that have made revolutions. Indeed, a great book is often a greater thing than a great battle. Even works of fiction have occasionally exercised immense power on society. Thus, Rabelais in France, Cervantes in Spain, overturned at the same time the dominion of monkery and chivalry, employing no other weapons but ridicule, the natural contrast of human terror. The people laughed and felt reassured. So Telemachus appeared and recalled men back to the harmonies of nature. Poets, says Hazlitt, quote, are a longer-lived race than heroes. They breathe more of the air of immortality. They survive more entire in their thoughts and acts. We have all that Virgil or Homer did, as much as if we had lived at the same time with them. We can hold their works in our hands, or lay them on our pillows, or put them to our lips. Scarcely a trace of what others did is left upon the earth, so as to be visible to common eyes. The one, the dead authors, are living men, still breathing and moving in their writings. The others, the conquerors of the world, are but the ashes in an urn. The sympathy between thought and thought is more intimate and vital than that between thought and action. Thought is linked to thought as flame kindles into flame. The tribute of admiration to the manes of departed heroism is like burning incense in a marble monument. Words, ideas, feelings, with the progress of time, harden into substances. Things, bodies, actions moulder away or melt into a sound, into thin air. Not only a man's actions are effaced and vanquished with him, his virtues and generous qualities die with him also. His intellect only is immortal and bequeathed unimpaired to posterity. Words are the only things that last forever. End quote. End of section 37.